What if I told you that our world is overflowing with misunderstood mysteries, profound enigmas that are incredibly difficult to explain through the lens of modern science alone? What if the very fabric of our reality hides secrets that have never been fully explained? Millions of people walk through the sliding doors of hospitals every single year. We view these buildings as places of healing, or sometimes as the final stop. But what if they are not just endpoints? What if they are doorways to something vastly more expansive? Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want to hear your perspective. In your opinion, do near-death experiences indicate the undeniable existence of life after passing away? Or can they be completely explained as the final chemical reactions of a fading brain? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have ever had an experience of stepping over the threshold and returning, and you wish to share your profound story with us, please fill out the form provided in the description of this video, or reach out to the contact email listed so we can share your journey anonymously. The man in today's story flatlined. The monitors showed zero activity, but during those critical moments, he was somewhere else entirely. And what he witnessed there still deeply impacts his every waking moment today. Everything went dark, but it was not at all like falling asleep. It was a complete, enveloping silence, a stillness that was heavier than anything I had ever felt in my physical life. Then, quite suddenly, I became entirely aware. I felt a pulling sensation. Slowly, inexorably, I was being drawn into something vast. At first, it was peaceful, almost too peaceful. And then, the absolute reality of what was happening shattered every preconceived notion I ever held. I was no longer in my physical body. I was somewhere else. To truly understand the magnitude of what happened to me, you have to understand the life I was leading before that fateful weekend. My existence was a continuous, never-ending loop of high-pressure demands and constant motion. I worked for a large-scale real estate development company, managing the construction of over 30 different homes simultaneously, each at completely different stages of development. My mornings started before the sun even considered rising. I would be out the door, fueled by nothing but stress and caffeine, managing contractors, solving endless logistical nightmares, and dealing with the immense pressure of timelines and budgets. I was essentially a machine, programmed to execute tasks and handle crises. By the time the late afternoon rolled around, there was absolutely no time to decompress. I would rush home, throw baseball bats, gloves, and sports equipment into the back of my truck, and immediately speed off to a baseball diamond or a soccer field. I spent nearly 2 decades coaching my kids and dozens of other teams. It was a beautiful thing, but it was incredibly taxing. We would finish practice just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and then the mad scramble for dinner would begin. Where are we eating? How fast can we get it? Then it was homework, baths, and collapsing into bed, only to wake up and do the exact same lather, rinse, repeat routine all over again. I was moving so fast through my own life that I never actually stopped to live it. My oldest son was getting married. He had graduated with a degree in the medical field, met a wonderful woman at our church, and they had planned a beautiful wedding for the very last weekend of the summer. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a final mini vacation to celebrate before the younger kids had to return to their classrooms. We decided to drive down to the coastal city where the wedding was being held a few days early, arriving on a Wednesday afternoon to just breathe and enjoy the ocean air. The hotel had this expansive, beautiful park right next to it. Naturally, my younger boys grabbed their plastic bats and wiffle balls and begged me to join them for a makeshift home run derby. I checked us into our rooms, dropped the bags, and ran out to the grass. We played for hours. We laughed, we ran, we enjoyed the sunshine. It was perfect. But later that Wednesday evening, a strange sensation began to creep over me. It started as a dull ache, a heavy feeling in my gut. I felt like I was coming down with a severe strain of the flu. I distinctly remember thinking about how incredibly inconvenient the timing was. Of all the weekends to get sick, it had to be the week of my son's wedding. I tried to push it out of my mind, assuming it was just exhaustion catching up with me. By Thursday, however, the discomfort in my stomach had morphed into a persistent, deep-seated pain. I tried to ignore it, slapping on a brave face for the family, but a quiet voice in the back of my head was whispering that something was fundamentally wrong. Friday arrived, and with it came the rehearsal dinner. By this point, I was burning up. I was running a significant fever and sweating profusely through my clothes. I tried to mask my misery with humor. I sat at the table, joking with the other guests, telling them that since this wedding was costing me a small fortune, I was absolutely going to eat every single dessert on the table to get my money's worth. But inside, I was deteriorating rapidly. After the dinner, my son and I sat together at the hotel bar. Knowing his medical background, he started asking me diagnostic questions. He looked at me with genuine concern and asked if I had ever had my appendix removed. I shook my head, telling him that it couldn't possibly be my appendix. I'd always heard that appendicitis came with a very specific, sharp point of tenderness on the lower abdomen. I didn't have that specific localized pain. My entire core just felt like it was on fire. I couldn't sleep. The pain and the fever were relentless. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, desperate for relief, I left the hotel and drove to a nearby convenience store to buy some fever-reducing medication. I swallowed the pills, hoping they would break the fever, but they did almost nothing. They barely took the edge off the agony. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling. By the time Saturday morning dawned, the actual day of the wedding, I looked absolutely terrible. All the color had drained from my face. I was pale, shivering, and completely exhausted. Yet somehow, purely on adrenaline and a father's determination, I forced myself through the entire wedding ceremony and the reception. As soon as the first few guests began to say their goodbyes, I turned to my family and told them I could not wait any longer. I had to get to an emergency room immediately. The drive to the hospital felt like it took hours. When I finally was called back to see the triage nurse, she took my vitals. My temperature was a staggering 104.3 degrees. I had not slept a single minute in over 24 hours. I was vibrating with sickness. The nurse began to gently press around on my abdomen, asking if it hurt. I told her no, not in the way she was pressing. Then she pulled out a small rubber reflex mallet. She went to the bottom of my feet. She tapped the heel of my left foot and asked if I felt any pain. I actually let out a weak laugh and said no. Then she moved to my right foot and tapped it with a mallet. The vibration shot straight up my leg and into my abdomen, and the sheer blinding agony made me scream out loud in the sterile emergency room. Her face dropped. She looked at me with complete certainty and said that my appendix was the issue, and she needed to page a surgeon immediately. She asked me when I had last engaged in any strenuous physical activity. I casually mentioned playing baseball with my boys on Wednesday afternoon. The color drained from her face. She started doing the mental math. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But my appendix had burst while I was swinging a bat 3 days prior. I was in a massive amount of danger. The toxicity would have been spreading through my system for 72 hours. Within 30 minutes, a surgeon rushed into my room. He looked at my charts, looked at me, and said my white blood cell count was astronomically high. He confirmed that the organ had likely ruptured days ago, and that they needed to open me up immediately to clean out the severe infection. Everything shifted into hyperspeed. The nurses swarmed around me, starting intravenous lines, prepping my skin, and pushing my rolling bed down the incredibly long, blindingly bright hallways of the hospital. I barely had time to murmur a weak goodbye to my terrified wife before the heavy double doors of the surgical suite burst open. They wheeled me inside, and the first thing that hit me was the absolute freezing temperature of the room. Despite the fact that my body was practically boiling with a fever over 104 degrees, and I was sweating through the sheets, the ambient cold of that operating theater was shocking. I remember laying there, shivering violently, wondering how the medical staff could possibly function in what felt like a meat locker. They asked me to slide over from my transport bed onto the actual surgical table. It felt incredibly narrow, so thin I was terrified I might slip off the edge. I felt awkward, uncomfortable, and overwhelmingly sick. I didn't even know where to rest my arms. And then it happened. I turned my head slightly to look to my right, and standing there, as physically real as the doctors in a room, was Jesus. The moment my eyes registered his presence, the entire operating room, the bright surgical lights, the beeping monitors, the doctors in their scrubs, the freezing air, the narrow table, simply vanished. It didn't fade away. It ceased to exist. All the people were gone. The room was gone. I was gripped by an immediate, profound confusion. My mind raced, trying to logically process an impossible situation. I remember thinking to myself, am I no longer alive? Have I passed away? I'd always heard stories about people who slipped away, how they would float up to the ceiling and look down at their own physical bodies lying on the table below. But I wasn't floating. I wasn't looking down at anything. I was standing right there, completely grounded in this new reality. So I reasoned with myself that I must not have passed away, but I had absolutely no idea what was happening. This was not a hallucination induced by the fever. This was not a dream brought on by anesthesia. This was a heightened state of absolute reality. It felt more real, more sharp, and more undeniable than any waking moment I had ever experienced in my entire life. My eyes locked onto the man standing before me. His appearance challenged the Sunday school pictures I had seen as a child. His skin was deeply tanned, a rich, dark olive tone, very much resembling a man of Middle Eastern descent. He was draped in a pristine, flowing white garment. His hair was a cascade of thick, wavy brown locks. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. They were a striking, deep greenish blue, and when he looked at me, he didn't just look at my face. He looked directly, piercingly, right into the very core of my soul. There was no judgment in that gaze, only a wave of pure, unadulterated, overwhelming love that physically emanated from him and washed over me. It was a love so powerful, so absolute, that it instantly erased any lingering doubt in my mind. The sheer force of his affection and his presence was the ultimate confirmation. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly who he was. He slowly extended his hand toward me, his voice carrying a resonance that I felt in my chest. He said he wanted to answer my prayer. I stood there, utterly bewildered. My prayer? What prayer was he talking about? My mind scrambled for context. And then, a memory from decades ago slammed into my consciousness. I remembered being a young boy, standing in a large, echoing Catholic church for my grandfather's funeral. I remembered the priest standing at the front, gently swinging a golden vessel on a long chain. I remembered the sweet, heavy scent of the smoke billowing out of the holes in the metal ball, drifting slowly upward toward the vaulted ceiling. The priest had spoken to the grieving family, explaining that the rising smoke represented our collective prayers ascending into the heavens. He spoke of how my grandfather was now in a place where there was absolutely no more pain, no more sorrow, no more crying, and no more suffering. As a child, I had listened to those words and thought about how magnificent such a place must be. I had closed my eyes and offered a simple, silent childhood prayer, asking Jesus to show me that place someday. I had completely forgotten that moment for 40 years. But he had not. Without hesitation, I reached out and took his extended hand. The moment our skin touched, the environment shifted instantly. We were no longer in a void. We were standing atop a gently rolling hill. The sky, or whatever was above us, was bathed in the most brilliant, purest, whitest light I have ever encountered. It was a light so intense that it bordered on blinding, yet it didn't hurt my eyes. It was pure luminescence. I looked down at myself and realized I was completely barefoot, still wearing the thin, embarrassing surgical gown from the hospital. But beneath my bare feet was a carpet of the most exquisite, manicured grass imaginable. It was a vibrant, deeply saturated bluish green. And here is where the heightened reality truly manifested. My senses were magnified to an incomprehensible degree. As I stood on that lush turf, I could distinctly feel the individual pressure of every single blade of grass pressing against the soles of my feet. It wasn't a generalized feeling of softness. It was an acute awareness. I felt as though I possessed the cognitive capacity to instantly calculate and count the exact number of grass blades making contact with my skin. The sensory input was overwhelming, yet perfectly clear. As my eyes gradually adjusted to the brilliant, radiant whiteness surrounding us, I noticed another source of light off to my right. It was a concentration of brightness, even more intense than the ambient glow. It was mesmerizing. And as I stared into it, suddenly, objects began to shoot out from the center of that concentrated light. They looked like cylindrical beams, somewhat resembling the long fluorescent light tubes you might see mounted in a workshop ceiling, except these were shorter, perhaps 2 feet in length, and slightly thicker. They were perfectly smooth and pulsed with a vibrant, living, glowing white energy. These beams of solid light began flying past me, zipping through the air with incredible speed. They were shimmering, almost vibrating with energy. I stood there, awestruck and still deeply confused. My mind was struggling to categorize anything I was witnessing. I watched these living light tubes dance around the sky, until suddenly, I realized one was hurtling directly toward my head. I panicked for a fraction of a second, wondering if I was supposed to duck or try to dodge it. Before I could move, the cylinder of light struck me squarely in the center of my forehead. But there was no pain. Instead, as the light made contact, it emitted a soft, gentle buzzing frequency. The beam passed entirely through my physical form, and as it traveled through me, it deposited a wave of the most profound, comforting, absolute warmth I have ever felt. The freezing, shivering cold of the hospital operating room, the deep aches of my infected body, all of it was instantly eradicated, replaced by a soothing heat that settled into my very bones. Just as I registered this magnificent healing warmth, the overwhelming white light that had obscured my vision began to pull away. It was as if an invisible hand grasped a massive, glowing curtain from my right side and swept it gracefully over to my left. The thick, white fog was pulled back, revealing a vista of unimaginable beauty. I realized I was standing on a high vantage point. Covering the slopes of the hill below me were thousands of delicate, beautiful flowers. They resembled sweet peas, with soft, intricate petals painted in an array of breathtaking pastel colors, soft purples, radiant yellows, warm oranges, and gentle pinks. But what captivated me was their movement. They were swaying and dancing rhythmically, as if caught in a gentle, rolling breeze. Yet the air around me was completely still. There was absolutely no wind. I watched them sway, marveling at the impossibility of their joyful dance. My gaze traveled further down the hill, following the receding white mist. The fog had settled thickly into a massive, sprawling valley far below. Protruding through the dense blanket of white mist, I could see the upper architecture of a truly colossal city. I could only see the rooftops, but the scale was staggering. The structures spanned for miles across the valley floor. Dominating the skyline was an enormous, brilliantly shining gold dome, similar in shape to a grand capitol building, but infinitely larger and more pristine. Surrounding it were several smaller, perfectly proportioned gold domes. Interspersed among these golden structures were tall, stark white spires that pierced through the fog, resembling the towering steeples of ancient cathedrals. Beyond the expansive, mist-shrouded city, rising majestically on the far side of the valley, was a massive mountain range. The slopes were thickly forested with pine trees. But these were not ordinary trees. Each one was mathematically perfect, symmetrical, and vibrantly, impossibly green. And crowning the entire breathtaking panorama, resting directly above the peaks of the perfectly shaped trees, was a sunset that defies human vocabulary. The sky was saturated with the richest, deepest bands of color I have ever witnessed. It started with blazing reds and fiery oranges, melting seamlessly into brilliant yellows, which then transitioned into deep, majestic purples, striking greens, and finally, a piercing, crystal-clear, bright blue at the very zenith of the sky. It was a masterpiece of light and color. The glowing cylindrical light beams were still rocketing out of the intense brightness to my right, but now they were traversing the entire expanse of the valley. I watched as one of the flying light tubes arced across the sky and collided directly with the very tip of one of the towering pine trees on the distant mountain. The impact was spectacular. It was as if the top of the tree was capped with a flawless diamond. When the glowing beam struck the peak, it shattered, bursting into hundreds of brilliant, tiny, sparkling streaks of white light. Within moments, the entire mountain range was illuminated by these cascading, bursting beams. The lights ricocheted and exploded in absolute silence, painting the landscape with radiant energy. It was like watching a gargantuan cosmic fireworks display, but every explosion was a pure, glowing, fluorescent white. I stood there, utterly captivated, completely lost in the sheer majesty of the spectacle. I finally pulled my eyes away from the dazzling display over the valley and turned my head back toward the source of the intense light, right where Jesus was standing beside me. He looked at me, his eyes overflowing with that same profound love, and he spoke softly but with absolute authority. He told me that what I was witnessing was the sheer glory of the Lord. The moment those words washed over me, the sheer weight of their truth and the unimaginable power of the environment caused all the strength to instantly drain from my body. I physically could not remain standing. My knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed toward the brilliant blue-green grass. The absolute instant my knees made contact with the ground, a violent electrical shock ripped through my entire being. It was a massive jolt of energy that violently ripped me away from the hillside, away from the dancing flowers, away from the golden city, and away from the presence of Jesus. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. The breathtaking scenery was gone, replaced instantly by the sterile, clinical ceiling of a hospital room. A doctor, his face obscured by a surgical mask, was leaning urgently over me. The very first words I heard were him loudly asking if I knew my own name. I tried to speak, but my mouth and throat felt like they were coated in dry sand. I could barely move my tongue. Through sheer willpower, I managed to croak out my first name. The doctor let out a heavy sigh of relief and said that was good. Then he asked me if I knew where I was. The confusion slammed back into me, hitting me harder than before. Where was I? I was just on the hill. I was just looking at the city. Where did the immense light go? My brain desperately scrambled to piece together the fractured timeline of my reality. I remembered the pain. I remembered the emergency room. I remembered my son's wedding. I forced my brain to recall the geographical location of the hospital. I whispered the name of the beach town we had driven to. The doctor nodded, clearly satisfied with my cognitive function. He turned his head and spoke to the other people in the room. It was only then that my peripheral vision adjusted, and I realized I was surrounded by at least 5 medical professionals, all dressed in surgical scrubs, all staring at me with a mixture of intense relief and shock. The doctor announced to the room that I was back, that I was going to be okay. He immediately ordered the staff to transport me up to the intensive care unit. As the nurses bustled around my bed, preparing to move me, I slowly turned my head to the side. Sitting against the wall, plugged in and humming quietly, was a hospital crash cart. I stared at the defibrillator machine. One of the heavy paddles was resting awkwardly on its side, and the thick, coiled cords were dangling down toward the floor. It was blatantly obvious to anyone looking that the machine had just been deployed. One of the nurses was quietly moving over to the cart to properly wind the cords and reset the machine. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I hadn't just fallen asleep. I hadn't just been heavily medicated. My heart had stopped. I truly had stepped over the edge. I had passed away on that operating table. The following morning, as the heavy fog of the anesthesia and the trauma began to lift slightly, the lead surgeon walked into my room. He stood beside my bed, carefully checking my surgical incisions, pressing lightly around my bandaged abdomen, and reviewing my temperature charts. He had a very somber, serious look on his face. He stopped what he was doing, looked me directly in the eye, and told me that my internal situation was the absolute worst case he had ever operated on in his entire career. I offered a weak, tired smile and told him he must be kidding. He turned around, took a few steps toward the door as if to leave, but then he stopped in his tracks. He turned back around, walked right up to the side of my bed, leaned in close, and corrected himself. He said that he had technically seen worse cases, but those patients had never lived to talk about it. He told me that my surgery was the absolute worst case of severe internal rupture and infection he had ever seen, where the patient actually survived the ordeal. A few hours later, my wife was finally allowed to come into the room to see me. She was exhausted, terrified, and so relieved to see my eyes open. She sat gently on the edge of the bed, took my hand, and asked me how I was feeling. I told her I honestly wasn't feeling great yet, that my body was in agony. But then I looked at her, my heart racing in my chest, and I told her that she was absolutely not going to believe what had just happened to me. She leaned in, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern, and asked me what I meant. I opened my mouth to form the words. I wanted to tell her about the cold room, about the sudden warmth, about the hill, the grass, the city, and the man with the dark skin and the eyes of pure love. But the moment I tried to vocalize the experience, a massive, unstoppable wave of emotion rose up from my chest and completely choked off my vocal cords. I just started weeping. Uncontrollable, heavy tears rolled down my face. The sheer emotional weight of the divine presence I had felt was simply too massive to articulate. I realized in that moment that I wasn't emotionally or spiritually ready to try and explain the encounter. I couldn't find the words to describe Jesus without breaking down completely. So I shook my head and told her I couldn't talk about it yet. She came back the next day and asked again. Once more, I opened my mouth, and once more, the tears flowed immediately. I couldn't get a single syllable out. It took me 3 full days of processing the monumental shift in my reality before I could finally sit down with her, hold her hands, and recount the entire incredible journey. Even now, years later, just recalling the feeling of his presence, the absolute perfection of that love, brings tears to my eyes. It was the most deeply emotional, transformative event of my existence. When I finally managed to tell her the entire story, she sat there and cried with me. We both realized the profound gravity of what I had been given. Before my illness, I would have described myself as a very typical, casual Sunday Christian. I attended church services, I went through the motions, I listened to the sermons, but I didn't truly grasp the reality of it all. It was just a routine, a part of my cultural upbringing. But after stepping out of my body and standing on that grass, everything changed. I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that He is real. He is a genuine, tangible, living entity. The entire concept of an afterlife, of a heavenly realm, shifted from a vague, ethereal, cloudy concept into a concrete, physical reality. I realized that the realm I visited wasn't just a state of mind. It was a physical place, just existing on a different frequency, perhaps hidden behind a veil that we simply cannot see with our mortal eyes. My physical recovery was grueling. Because of the severe damage to my digestive tract, I was placed on a strict, miserable liquid diet for nearly a week. I was still fighting off a persistent fever, and the doctors made it very clear that until my core temperature stabilized and my system proved it could handle digestion, I wasn't going anywhere. For 12 agonizing days, I lived in that hospital room. My body completely wasted away. I lost 34 pounds in less than 2 weeks. I looked like a skeleton of my former self. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor walked in and announced that they were going to upgrade me to semi-solid foods to test my gastrointestinal tract. One of the very first things they brought me on that plastic hospital tray was a single, simple yellow banana. I cannot express the joy I felt looking at that piece of fruit. After subsisting on nothing but clear, salty beef broth for days, it looked like a feast. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly from weakness, and I slowly began to peel back the skin. And right there, in that sterile hospital bed, holding a partially peeled banana, the sheer staggering weight of divine creation hit me like a freight train. I stopped moving. I just stared at the fruit, and the tears began to fall all over again. I started sobbing uncontrollably. My mind expanded to encompass the entire journey of that single piece of food. I thought about how this fruit had grown out of the dark, seemingly dead dirt, absorbing water and sunlight from thousands of miles away. I thought about the intricate, complex biological systems designed to produce it, and how it was now sitting in my hands, perfectly packaged by nature, containing the exact nutrients my broken, emaciated body needed to rebuild its strength and heal. The profound interconnectedness of God's design, the delicate, intentional care woven into the fabric of the natural world, overwhelmed me completely. The banana was no longer just food. It was a profound, tangible miracle of engineering and grace. Part of the recovery protocol after major abdominal surgery is forcing the patient to walk. They need to get your circulation moving and wake up your internal organs. I vividly remember the day the nurse came into my room, clapping his hands together, and announced that today was the day I had to get out of bed and walk the hallways. I was terrified. It took an agonizing effort just to swing my legs over the side of the mattress. I had 4 different intravenous bags hanging from a metal pole on wheels, and I had medical tubes protruding from places on my body that I didn't even know they could put tubes into. The nurse gripped my arm firmly, helping me stand, and I gripped the cold metal of the forced stand like a lifeline. We began a painfully slow, shuffling progression down the long hospital corridor. As we inched our way along the linoleum floor, I stopped to look at the artwork hanging on the sterile walls. Because the hospital was located in a coastal community, the walls were decorated with large, framed photographs of local scenery. There were sweeping pictures of the ocean crashing against rocks and stunning, vibrant photographs of the sun setting over the water. I stood there, leaning heavily on my 4-pole, staring intensely at those framed images. A profound wave of regret and realization washed over me. I thought back to the 20 years of my life I had spent rushing from construction sites to baseball fields, eating fast food in my truck, constantly checking my watch, constantly stressing over deadlines and schedules. I looked at the beauty captured in those photographs and thought to myself, what in the world have I been missing all these years? I had been surrounded by this breathtaking beauty my entire life, and I had completely ignored it because I was too busy, too stressed, too consumed by the trivial machinery of daily existence. Right then and there, shuffling down a hospital hallway, I made a vow to completely change the trajectory of my life. The transformation after returning from that realm was absolute and permanent. The man who used to run 35 construction sites and stress over every minor delay passed away on that operating table, and a completely different person woke up. I made a conscious, deliberate decision to fundamentally slow down the pace of my existence. I decided to stop running and start living. Now, I make it a point to deeply, intentionally enjoy every single micro moment of my life. If I am walking through a park or down a sidewalk and I see a vibrant flower blooming, I will absolutely stop dead in my tracks, bend down, and smell it. I will examine its petals and marvel at its color. I do not care in the slightest if the people walking past me think I look strange or eccentric. My mobile phone's photo gallery is completely full of hundreds of pictures of sunsets, interesting cloud formations, and beautiful plants. I feel as though my vision has been reset. I am looking at the world through the wide, unfiltered, deeply appreciative eyes of a child, marveling at the incredible gift of simply being alive on this earth. Jesus never gave me a specific, articulated assignment when I was standing with him on that brilliantly lit hill. He didn't hand me a list of tasks to complete upon my return. But deep in my spirit, I know exactly what my purpose is now. I believe with all my heart that he wants me to share my story with anyone who will listen. He wants me to tell people to slow down, to breathe, to step off the relentless treadmill of modern life, and to truly look at the incredible beauty of the creation that surrounds them every single day. I firmly believe that is our fundamental purpose as human beings, to experience, appreciate, and boldly spread the unconditional love of the Creator. I am not a special person. I am not a prophet, and I am certainly not loved by the Creator any more than the person sitting next to me or the person walking down the street. We are all loved equally, with an intensity we cannot comprehend. I constantly tell people now, if you want to know if it's real, simply ask. Ask for the Creator to reveal himself to your heart. But I also add a word of caution. You must be incredibly patient. My simple, childhood prayer at a funeral took exactly 40 years to be answered in that freezing operating room. But when you step outside the boundaries of our physical reality, what exactly is 40 years in the grand, sweeping face of eternity? It is nothing but a fleeting breath. I can honestly say that I am no longer afraid of the end of my physical life. The paralyzing fear of the unknown that haunts so many people has been completely eradicated from my mind. I know exactly what is waiting for me. I often think about the moment when my heart stops for the final time, and I do not wake up in a hospital bed. I picture myself appearing right back on that incredibly beautiful, lush, blue-green hill. I picture Jesus walking toward me with that same smile, looking into my eyes and saying, "Welcome back. Let's go see the rest of the things you didn't have time to see that day. Let's go walk through the streets of that grand golden city. Let me show you around your true home." I look forward to that incredible day with absolute joy. But I always follow that thought with a quiet whisper to the heavens, but not today. Please, not yet. There is still so much beautiful life left to experience here on this earth. If I had not returned from that operating room all those years ago, I would have missed out on decades of joy. I have 13 beautiful grandchildren now. I would never have met a single one of them. I would never have held them, laughed with them, or watched them grow. And ultimately, as I look at my life now, I think that is exactly why he sent me back. He let me live so I could truly learn how to be alive. And this profound journey raises a final, echoing question, one that lingers in the quiet spaces of our minds. What else is still hidden, waiting silently, just beyond the veil of our perception, hidden in plain sight? This experience wasn't just a brush with the end. It was a violent, beautiful awakening. Regardless of what you believe lies on the other side of that final heartbeat, the lessons brought back are universally vital. To slow down, to breathe, to see the miraculous in the mundane, to love without reservation. Let us know in the comments exactly what you thought about everything you heard today. How does this story change your perspective on your own daily life? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to explore more incredible, unexplainable experiences that challenge everything we know. Until next time, keep your eyes open to the beauty around you.